Welcome to session 94 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 4th of April. Today we'll be looking at 1 Kings 1 to 3 and Psalm 94. But first of all, let's get an overview. 1st and 2nd Kings, while two books in our Bible, were originally written as one continuous story. They make up part of the Deuteronomistic books from Deuteronomy through to 2nd Kings that chart Israel's history from outside Canaan through to the Israelites being exiled from their land. They're called Deuteronomistic books because they are told through the lens of Deuteronomy 28 that obedience leads to blessing and disobedience leads to curse. 1st and 2nd Kings pick up the story from 1st and 2nd Samuel. David has united the tribes of Israel into one kingdom, and in 2nd Samuel 7 we read as God promised David that his descendants would reign forever. At the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we saw thoroughly flawed David who was committed to God and making up for his mistakes once he realised what he'd done. We then enter 1st and 2nd Kings, hopeful that kings that come after David will be loyal and faithful to God and lead the people into what God had called them to back in Genesis 12, to be examples of God's order and beauty to the rest of the world, leading all the people back to God. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. But we start with 1 Kings 1 to 11, and that's Solomon's reign. And that can be broken up in chapters 1 to 2, David and Solomon, chapters 3 to 4, Solomon asks for wisdom, chapters 5 to 8, Solomon builds the temple, and chapters 9 to 11, Solomon's downfall. We then get 1 Kings 12 to 13, where Israel splits in two, and then 1 Kings 14 all the way through to 2 Kings 8, where we get Israel's kings versus their prophets. This is a section where it lists through all the different kings, and we get to see some of the prophets that led them and shaped them. So 1 Kings 14 to 16 is shaped by the prophets Ahijah and Jehu. 1 Kings 17 all the way to 2 Kings 2 is shaped by Elijah, and then 2 Kings 3 to 8 is Elisha. Then we get 2 Kings 9 to 17, which is the road to exile of the northern kingdom by Assyria, and then we get 2 Kings 18 to 25, which is the road to exile of the southern kingdom by Babylon. That section is broken up by chapters 19 to 20, which is the Hezekiah, chapter 21, which is King Manasseh, chapter 22 to 23, which is Josiah, and then chapters 24 to 25, which is the exile. There are two key themes in these books. The first is the assessment of each king. Each king is judged based on three criteria. Do they worship God, the God of Israel alone? Do they get rid of all the idolatry in Israel? And are they faithful to the covenant with God? The second key theme is the introduction of the role of the prophets. While we've seen prophets in the past, it's in this period of Israel's history that they really come into the fore. They serve as wake-up calls for the people of Israel. They call out idolatry and injustice with the hope that the people change their ways. But let's jump in with today's reading, 1 Kings 1 to 3. At the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we saw David's reign coming to an end. At this point, David is incredibly old and frail. One of his sons uses this to his advantage. Without his father knowing, Adonijah gets all the significant leaders within Israel, apart from the ones really close to David, and brings them to a feast celebrating his new reign as king. Included amongst these leaders is Joab. Once again, he's at the centre of trouble for the kingdom. Nathan the prophet finds out about this, and with Bathsheba tells David. They point out that David originally had said to Bathsheba's son Solomon he was to be king. So David gets those leaders who weren't invited to Adonijah's feast together and has them anoint Solomon as the new king. When the men at Adonijah's feast hear about this, they quickly leave, not wanting to associate with Adonijah. Adonijah fears for his life and flees, saying he won't come back until Solomon promises not to kill him, which Solomon does, for now. While we might be relieved that this didn't blow up into another big fight between members of David's family, it's still less than ideal. At least when there were judges, leaders naturally arose amongst the people. It was all fairly democratic in some sort of way, but now there is a power-grabbing and political manoeuvring to try and win power for yourself. It's definitely not the kind of kingdom that God wants to build. We see this reflected in David's last words to Solomon. He encourages him to be faithful to God, which is good. It's similar to the last word of Isaac to his son. But then David tells Solomon to kill all the people he never got round to disciplining, like Joab and Shimei. Solomon does exactly that. First, he finds an excuse to have his brother Adonijah killed. After that, Joab and Shimei follow. He also removes from power people he doesn't like, such as Abiathar. By the end of 1 Kings 2, Solomon has fully cemented his position as king, but he has spilled a lot of blood in the process. At the start of 1 Kings 3, he marries an Egyptian woman for political gain. In Deuteronomy 7, God warned the people against intermarrying with other nations, because these foreign partners will inevitably bring the worship of their gods into the house and contaminate the people of Israel. It's not looking good for Solomon. But then things start to look up. God looks favourably on Solomon and chooses to bless him, asking what he wants. Solomon asks for wisdom and understanding to lead the people well. Because Solomon chose well, God decides to give Solomon not only the wisdom he asked for, but also the success and wealth that he didn't ask for. We then see Solomon model this wisdom. Two women come to him with a baby they both claim to be theirs. It's only their word against the other, and so Solomon has to come up with a new way to work out who is the mother. It wasn't like they had DNA tests back then. He suggests that they cut the baby in half, knowing that the true mother of a baby would never willingly let her child be killed. Lo and behold, one of the women begs him not to do that, saying she would rather the other woman have the baby than for the baby to be cut in half. At that point, Solomon gives the baby back to her, and everyone is amazed at Solomon's wisdom. With this wisdom, Solomon might be a good king after all. But that's 1 Kings 1-3. Now let's look at Psalm 94. This psalm isn't attributed to anyone and falls into the category of lament psalm. It also incorporates elements of wisdom psalms with lessons and encouragements. It falls within a group of psalms focused on God as king, Psalms 93 to Psalm 99, but doesn't mention it here. Here's a summary of the structure. We have verses 1-7, a communal lament, verses 8-11, lessons for fools, verses 12-15, blessings for those who are loyal to God, and then verses 16-23, personal lament. The psalmist starts off with a call to the God of vengeance. They ask that God judge the earth and punish the proud. How long will the wicked flourish? They're crushing God's people, killing widows, foreigners, and orphans. These three are commonly used together to talk about vulnerable people groups. On top of that, the proud do not put their trust in God. At that, the psalmist turns, presumably to these proud people, and calls them foolish. They give these foolish people lessons on who God is, so that they might be wise. The proud say that God cannot see what they do, but the psalmist points out that God made the eye and the ear. Surely that God can also see and hear. He guided nations and teaches men knowledge. Surely that God will rebuke wicked nations and knows the thoughts of men. A blessed man or woman listens to God. They allow God to discipline them and teach them. In turn, God gives them rest and protection. In this, we get some declaration of trust after the opening communal lament psalm. While God's people are currently surrounded by enemies, God will not forsake his people. Justice will return. And then the psalmist moves to a more personal lament. God may look after his nation, but who is going to defend the psalmist personally? The psalmist immediately answers the question, God. If it wasn't for God, the psalmist would be dead. Every time it felt like they were failing, God was the one that helped them with his faithful love. When it felt like the weight of the world was upon them, God was the one that gave them joy. Looking at their enemies, the psalmist asks if the wicked could ever be on God's side. They are full of injustice, oppressing the righteous and the innocent. But while these enemies seek the psalmist's life, God is their protection. He will defeat the wicked. The psalmist has worked through their lament and struggles. They started off at a communal level and strengthened themselves with the knowledge that the wickedness is foolishness and God protects the righteous. They then moved to their own personal lives and worked through the same ideas. While life may be hard, the wise and good thing is to trust in God. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.